Move swift as the wind and closely formed as the wood. Attack like the fire and be still as the mountain. Sun Tzu, The Art of War.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses. We are talking about one of my favorite ways of killing people, and that is with your bare hands today.
You talk as if you have some experience.
Nothing you can prove. There are three main facets that we're going to be talking about today. They are blunt force trauma, suffocation or asphyxiation, and blood loss or exsanguination. Each of those are going to get their own separate episodes when we will be talking about different tools that people use to get these particular effects. But today we're talking about how you do that with your empty hands for the most part.
Overall, when it comes to hand-to-hand killing, it is very brutal. It is very personal. So that is something you really have to take into consideration. It is rare that planned killers will use their bare hands. It's not unheard of, but it's rare.
Yeah, at that point, it's kind of a revenge killing. There's still a definite emotional quality to that.
So with the three different categories, when it comes to the manner of death, you have the blunt force trauma. This is most often in a melee hand-to-hand situation going to be due to punching.
If you hit the right spot, then you can rupture a kidney or a spleen. If you've seen Kill Bill, there's that exploding heart technique, the 5-finger palm to the heart. It theoretically could work, but I can't see that working on a moving victim.
And then, of course, you have what you probably thought of first is the brain damage. Skull fractures, any damage to the nose and ocular region that can cause fracturing that damages the brain.
The next way that a lot of people think about hand-to-hand combat comes from a lot of Brazilian jiu-jitsu and Greco-Roman wrestling, these kinds of things. And that is a lot of the submission combat, which comes down to suffocation.
So you'll get a lot of the choking. In grappling situations, your goal is to subdue, lock in, and usually control the head and limbs in some way. That usually takes into consideration cutting off the airways and blood flow to the brain.
Another way you could suffocate someone is by puncturing the lung. There's a floating rib that can be knocked out of place and actually pierce the lung if you hit it in the right spot and hit it hard enough. So you can suffocate someone from the inside out.
Another cause of suffocation in a hand-to-hand combat sort of situation is actually being knocked unconscious for too long. In reality, if somebody gets knocked out, it is at most about 6 seconds long before there's permanent brain damage. If they're knocked out longer than that, it can cause some of the brain to shut down, and it can cause some form of suffocation depending on what exactly caused the unconsciousness.
Yeah, if the blood is not flowing to the brain, a lot of the purpose of the blood is to bring oxygen to the rest of the body. So that's kind of why it falls into the suffocation category.
And then the final category is your blood loss. If you're doing hand-to-hand, there is not often going to be blood loss to the extent of killing someone externally. However, you could have internal bleeding. Once again, we are going to get into what these things do to the body. We may get a little bit descriptive, so this is your warning before we get too much into the details here. What happens to the body in a blunt force trauma situation largely depends on what area is going to get hit. So we're going to first talk about blunt force trauma to the head.
In the scene where the head trauma has occurred, there's going to be a loss of consciousness, a headache, memory loss, confusion, and strangely enough, there's often nausea. When your body experiences pain that it doesn't know how to tell you because there are no nerve endings in that region, it often presents as nausea, and that's kind of what's happening here.
There can be delayed reactions to having blunt force trauma to the head that will ultimately kill you if it's not treated and taken care of. Basically, the areas in your brain that control everything else is going haywire and unable to actually do anything. You'll experience a lot of ringing in the ears, dizziness, balance problems. And then, most notably, you will have sleep disturbances.
In the incredibly long term, if you survive this long, then it's probably not going to kill you. You have some very bad things that can happen if the brain is misaligned. Things like memory loss, complete change of personality and character, speech difficulties, impaired judgment, these kinds of things that are very difficult to heal from because of the change of character that came from the blunt force trauma to the head.
Now, head injuries are not the only way you can experience blunt force trauma. Other ways can basically cause organ failure. We will refer you to our previous episodes about poisons because the organ failure will play out very similarly to what it does when poisons affect the organs and start to make them shut down.
I feel like suffocation is going to be one of the more obvious ones of they can't breathe. They're having a hard time talking. They might lose consciousness or have a raspy or hoarse voice, especially if the damage was done to the throat area. You can actually pop the windpipe and disconnect it right at the base of the throat where it meets the collarbone, and that can suffocate you and while you're trying to talk but it's not working. That's a fun one.
That's one of the things that investigators will look to help determine cause of death of suffocation. If it was a manual strangulation using the hands, more often than not, that hyoid bone will get broken in the process. Another thing to consider when it comes to suffocation with that manual strangulation, it can take minutes before somebody actually dies from suffocation due to strangling them.
You mean I can't just put a pillow over their face while they're sleeping and 4 seconds later walk out?
Correct. It takes a lot longer because your body can handle being without oxygen for a couple of minutes. It's not good for the body, but it can handle it so long as your heart is still beating. Another thing that will result from suffocation is face and lip discoloration, as well as blood vessels in the eyes. It'll experience petechial hemorrhaging because basically the blood vessels in the eyes will begin to burst.
If we're looking at the symptoms of blood loss, I feel like if it's an external bleeding, that's kind of obvious. There's blood gushing out. They're wet. Visually pretty obvious. Internal can have some more subtle ones, like if you have a cold sweat with no apparent indicator as far as why that's happening, extreme thirst. Some of the more obvious ones would be if you're vomiting coffee grounds, that means the blood has gotten into your digestive tract and you are throwing it up. So if there are stomach ulcers or, a stab or something like that.
You can also experience a lot of extreme bruising if the internal bleeding is close enough to the skin that it will show that pooling of blood. Because that's what a bruise is leaking blood. Because this takes so much more work, so much more skill in some cases, if you're doing jujitsu or martial art-based killing, it takes a very particular kind of person to go through with the effort of killing someone without the use of a tool.
In the poison episodes, we talked about the killer often wanting to be distanced from the person that they are killing because the kill is almost never immediate. In this particular case, they want to be there. There's an emotional connection almost always to this type of a killing, especially if it's planned out ahead of time. It's not self-defense. Because they want to see the light leave the eyes of this person who killed their dog.
So most of these killings will be very emotional. They will be incited by some kind of rage, some form of very passionate emotion. Almost all revenge killings in stories are done with this kind of melee combat because they want to be in control over the other person.
The other side of this coin that you will see on occasion aligns with a lot of your mentor characters, and those are the ones that have that deep spiritual connection with the martial art. So yes, Uncle Iroh can wipe out a whole bunch of people, he's very powerful, but he's a deeply spiritual kind of person, and therefore, even though he can, he only does it when he must. This tends to be your good side of the shoulder angel category character. Now, if we're looking at historical context, this is one of the oldest, if not the oldest way of killing somebody is without even a tool. We do see it across the planet in every culture and every civilization, and it pops up in a handful of different ways.
One of the ways that I generally think of this melee combat is a result of an oppressed group rising up to fight against their oppressors and learning different techniques to be able to fight them. In Brazil, there was capoeira, which was kind of like a dancing sort of martial art that people were able to practice because it looked like a dance, but it was a way of fighting against their oppression because they didn't have the ability to use tools or make weapons.
You will often see this type of skill set being trained in militaries, not as a primary go out there and punch things, but you will see it as a supplement if the ranged weapons aren't working, if you lose your sword. These kinds of things might be a skill that comes in when you need it most.
I believe it was my great-grandfather in World War I who taught jujitsu to other soldiers. He was like a jujitsu trainer in the army because it was a useful tool when people lost their weapons.
So if you were to write this type of a murder, the thing you will have to understand first is the mentality of your killer, why they're doing it, why they're approaching it in this particular way. Because if they're very distant from the person, and if they're trying to build a good alibi, this and that, then this might not be the best way to murder your characters. But if it's a crime of passion or they're wanting to feel something and they're building it up for the moment where they just need to let this rage out and see the light leave somebody's eyes, this might be a good option for you.
All you have to do first, though, is...
Right, selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.